You know that feeling when you're juggling 10 things at once and someone asks you one more small favor and suddenly you just can't? Or maybe it's the opposite. You shut down completely, can't make the simplest decision, feel like you're watching life from behind glass. That's your mental capacity talking. Today, we're diving into what capacity actually is with our coach success manager, Richard Mattingly. We're going to discuss why some days your container feels bottomless and other days a single email can tip you over the edge. And most importantly, how to work with what you've got and maybe even expand it over time. I'm John, and this is That's the Rep by Forte. Welcome back to the podcast, Richard. Our last time together was great, and we had such an awesome time learning about mental composition. So I'm pumped for today's conversation, and we're going to jump right into it with the question we need to ask. What is mental capacity?
Well, John, first off, just want to say I really enjoyed our last conversation. Just appreciated getting to share in each other's story, and I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. And just now when you were kind of doing your intro and you were talking about what mental capacity is, I couldn't help but think like, man, I've run into that so much. Where I feel like the hair that breaks the camel's back, the straw that breaks the camel's back, I think is the expression.
Yep.
Or the other example was you feel like you're looking at life from behind glass. Yeah. All too often I've run into that experience myself. So to your question, what actually is capacity? I think, first I'll say what it's not. Oftentimes, when we think of capacity, we just think of our ability to do more. But the reality is so many of us are doing more, but we're operating outside of people call it different things, right? Flow state, we're operating outside of our sense of well-being. And the reality is that we're just pushing ourselves harder and harder. And we're probably actually grinding what matters most, our sense of self, into the ground. So our capacity to take a step back and say for a second, it's not just our ability to do more. It's actually our ability to do things in connection with our sense of true self, where there's this felt sense of like, I know who I am. This feels true. I feel like I'm in connection with who I am and with others. And I can, not that it's perfect. But there's this sense of calm and sense of peace associated with that. And when you're in that place, you can actually kind of go through life's ups and downs without either being, chronically overwhelmed, which is one of the states you experienced, or chronically shut down. And you can engage with what's in front of you with this sense of creativity, calm, you're connected to who you are, you're connected to others. Because we could totally operate on overdrive and it looks like capacity to others, but really in the long game, we're just eroding our sense of self from the inside out. Yeah,
as you were talking, I was getting the mental image of a battery, and we've got these rechargeable batteries out here, and it's easy to recharge them, over and over again. But I started to think of how often I've taken a battery that's low and used it anyways. Put it in a flashlight. It's not as bright as it needs to be, but it'll get the job done. And then it dies on me. And then I'll swap out one of the two batteries and make that work. And it's kind of that same idea of like, it can work, but it's not working to its fullest. It's not working in the way it's supposed to because it's almost fully drained, And I kind of liked that visual representation of that too, where you can be depleted and still survive in a sense, but you're not thriving. You're not really doing what your core purpose is. You're just kind of coasting at that point because that's the littlest you can do. I know you have a lot more to talk about with capacity, and there's something that you've told me about before, and I've looked into a little bit, is this window of tolerance and all of this kind of stuff. Can you explain that to me as we talk about capacity?
Yeah. One way to think about capacity is informed by the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And it's this
what
idea.
Is that?
It's just essentially the neuroscience of how we relate to one another.
Okay.
And there's this idea of a window of tolerance. And it's that when we're operating inside of our window of tolerance, it's essentially this optimal state of arousal of our nervous system. And at the top of our window of tolerance, when we start to exit out of what would be a sense of calm, a sense of creativity, a sense of connection. When we start to exit out of that, at the top of the window of tolerance is hyper arousal, which essentially is going to feel like anxiety. It's going to feel like over functioning in your physical body. You might like your heart is racing. You might have trouble sleeping because it's hard to shut your brain off. And it's like this felt sense of survival mode. And it's our nervous systems are designed to have hyperarousal for a reason. We need that. But the challenge becomes when it's chronic and we're constantly in this hyperarousal state. And on the bottom end of the window of tolerance is hypoarousal, which essentially kind of feels like depression. And again, it is the nervous system shut down. And it usually happens after we've been in hyperarousal for too long. Eventually, it can lead to this sense of being numb or being dissociated from your experience. And I loved what you said about it feels like you're looking at life from behind glass. That's kind of what that feels like. You feel a little bit disconnected from your experience and you're actually dissociating from it in order to avoid like the reality or the pain of what it's been like. And and those two states of hyperarousal or hypoarousal, when we're chronically in those, it can become really problematic for us as humans. And it's not realistic that we would always be inside of our window of tolerance, always operating inside of our capacity, because life has a lot of unexpected external stressors. There's so much that takes place. And the reality is that we don't really choose our window of tolerance. It happens to us over the course of life. And then one day we find ourselves, maybe it's watching a podcast like this or doing some sort of self-reflection and realizing like, oh man, I'm always triggered by XYZ. Or in this environment, this is really hard for me. I feel like I have very low capacity in this season. And all of a sudden you kind of, and a lot of times we end up getting into this bit of a shame narrative. Like, I can't believe I can't handle more, or I wish I was like that person. But we kind of just at some point in our life find ourselves where we're at. And it's less about, oh, this is your fault, and more of, okay, let's just get curious about how we got here and what we can do.
Yeah, I've got two things running through my head right now. Number one is it's interesting how you explain capacity as there can be two extremes, because I think when you think capacity, you might immediately go to how much can I handle? How much can I do? That's my capacity. And you're talking about this extreme end of hyperarousal and hypoarousal, this idea of you can be doing way too much and that's outside of your capacity. And then you can feel like I can't do anything, which is outside of your capacity. And to find that happy medium isn't always going to happen. And I can speak to that from my own experience. Over the last 6 months, I went through kind of this crazy chronic pain health journey, and I won't get into it. But what you were talking about is exactly how I felt, of like, as the man of the house, the husband, the father, someone who's needed at work. I should be able to do this. I should be able to do this. And really what I was doing was just numbing the fact that I physically couldn't do some things. And I kept telling myself, this shame narrative of you're not good enough because you can't do this. When my wife would constantly be like, John, it's okay. You physically can't. But to hear that as a man is like, I physically can't, but I should be able to. I got to have the strength. I got to have these things. Yeah. And it's amazing how your mind can play tricks on you when you're going through stuff that is something you can't control. All you want is control in that moment. And that's what was processing when you were talking about that.
Yes. Thank you so much, John, for sharing like that personally. Yeah. And I think you nailed, we kind of use fancy language of interpersonal neurobiology, hypoarousal, but to really simplify this, when we're inside of our window of tolerance and where our sense of self is connected, there's these two kind of like big life questions. And the answer is yes, when we really think about it. And that's when we feel inside of our window of tolerance. That's when we feel that we're operating in our capacities. Do I matter? And can I rely on others? And do I matter is an identity statement. and can I rely on others as a safety statement?
I like that.
So there's these two questions, and when we're experiencing life, and the question is, and there's this sense of maybe not, we end up going into what would be our learned way of trying to get an affirmative answer to that question. And I'll just use an example that's like top of mind for me, like coming in to record this podcast with you. There's anxiety, there's different things. And like the undercurrent of that question is like, am I going to be seen and perceived as significant? And it's a question of like my sense of identity, my sense of self. And if I feel like I might really disappoint you, John, if I feel like if this podcast goes well, I'm gonna lose my job. Can I rely on others? What I'm gonna do is naturally go into my way of kind of getting an affirmative answer, forcing an affirmative answer to that question, which throughout my life, it's been same as you. You described control. Hyper arousal is essentially control. And on the bottom, hypo arousal is essentially escape. So how I have dealt with problems in my life when I'm not sure if I'll be, that my sense of belonging, my sense of acceptance, maybe I feel like I'm going to disappoint someone. I usually just go into overdrive. I kind of overfunction to meet the expectations. And the problem with that is that it worked for a long time. But then you find yourself at some point in your life going like, it's not working anymore. I'm just tired. And things I can't control as much as I thought I could control. So then you're left with that same question. Do I matter? Can I rely on others? And then you start to really look at it and you're like, okay, do I matter? And I at the end of the day, just talking with our head of well-being, Sandia, about this, mental fitness can get this reputation of performance, of doing more, but we cannot perform and do more until we start with what's core, which is an affirmative answer of like, fundamentally, I believe I do when you matter, simply in and of who you are, not because of anything you do. And when I can think about relationships in my life that kind of can anchor me in that truth, because a lot of our window of tolerance is relational in terms of how it's formed. When I can think about relationships in my life that remind me of those things, all of a sudden I can show up to this podcast and maybe it's not gone completely because it's 33 years of my life of learning one way of operating, but at least it's a little bit more of background noise and a little more grace for the fact that sometimes I think that way. And then all of a sudden I'm in my capacity. And I'm not deteriorating my sense of self. I'm not overdriving. I'm not performing. It's not, oh man, this isn't about me feeling like I need to matter anymore. All of a sudden it becomes about the people who are listening to this. And hopefully this being something meaningful. So that I appreciate you bringing up a personal example, and that's what kind of came up for me as you said that.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating too that my window is going to look different than your window, and it's not the same size as mine, as our partners, as our coworkers. Everybody has a different window of tolerance. So the question becomes, where did your particular window come from? Why is your capacity the way that it is? And it turns out a lot of your capacity could be shaped long before you had any say in the matter. And I'm curious if we can talk about how that works. How does a person's capacity even come to be? Because you were talking about escaping earlier, and I'm a person who wants control, but if I don't have it, I'll go to that opposite end and escape. And I'll find something that I can do where I feel like maybe I don't have control, but I can get lost in this thing. Why did I start doing that? How does a person's capacity come to be?
Yeah, definitely. It's such a good question. And we won't cover so much of how we come to be and arrive in this present moment. There's one way to think about it is biopsychosocial. We have our biology, our psychology, and then our social, our environment.
Okay.
and we'll kind of just touch on like an aspect of that, I think, for the sake of this conversation. And one way to think about it, and I think I actually said this on our last podcast, but we come out of the womb looking for someone looking for us. And innate from the very beginning of our life is this need to be the 5 S's: seen, soothed, safe, and secure. And when that need is consistently met throughout the course of our life, and by consistently met, I don't mean that you had a perfect caretaking, parent, family of origin type of scenario. Consistently met also includes when it wasn't met, but there's repair, and you're able to make sense of why you didn't feel safe or why you didn't feel seen in a certain thing without it becoming about I'm bad, right? Without this harmful internal narrative developing. It's not that your family was perfect,
right?
But there's this general consistency, and as that happens over the course of your life, you can begin to internalize the love of others that you've hopefully received in somewhat of a consistent way. And in the human story, that's not the case. All of us haven't received it consistently throughout our life.
Right.
But when essentially we're able to internalize, and the answer to that question of do I matter? Maybe you don't even think about it. There's just this internal anchor that you've been seen throughout the course of your life, particularly in moments of vulnerability when you were afraid you weren't going to be accepted, that you are then able to internalize like, okay, I am seen for who I am and I'm accepted.
Towards the end, you said, I'm seen for who I am, because we live in a culture where we're seen for what we do. When we meet someone new, what's your name? What do you do? That's just kind of this process that we have. And my identity for 2 decades of my life was in what I did. I had this title. And when I left that job, I went through about 1.5 years of like, who am I? Like this whole process of, I thought my life was this, and I went to school for this, and I had this job for almost 20 years, and now I don't. Well, then who am I? And what it came back to was, I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm a guy who wants to love my family. That's what matters. And yes, I can do a job and I have these talents, I have these giftings, but who I am is my anchor, as you were talking about, is my values, my core. And I think that this idea of mental capacity ties into what we talked about with Cynthia last time of mental flexibility. If you don't have your anchor to be able to hold yourself in place, you're going to get tossed by the wind. Even if you do get tossed by the wind, though, and you have that anchor, you'll still be there when you're done. And I think capacity has this same idea of, you have to have the anchor, because if you're in hyper arousal or hypo arousal, it's easy to escape or it's easy to control and leave behind that anchor. So I loved what you said there, because it is, I want to be seen for who I am, not what I do.
Yes. And we all, as we're going through our developmental experiences of life, we have our autonomic nervous system paying attention to our caretaker's expression on their face, right? Or their tone of voice, or their body language. And that is so ingrained in us that when, for example, nowadays, let's say I'm met with an like eye contact in a certain way or a tone of voice, without me intentionally thinking I'm not safe here, a whole network of associations is like basically set off. And autonomic, you could think automatic. And that's why that kind of helps diffuse shame, right? Like when you start going into hyperarousal, into control mode, maybe it's subtle, but it's usually not actually a conscious decision. There's this network of associations in our nervous system that is primed to try and get an affirmative answer to the question, do I matter? Am I, can I rely on others? And you get really good at, you have these functional ways of making sure that those needs get met. And it kind of diffuses the shame. Like, oh man, like, okay, I escape when things get really tough. Like, probably just it works. It's like when you feel like to escape is what an amazing way that our culture offers us, whether it's through our phones or through substance or through just diving into work. It's super functional. And it kind of it's like, oh yeah, okay, I get why I did that now. And then at some point you get to start deciding, is that how I want to continue living? And there's a negotiation that comes with that decision point, because it's gonna feel more vulnerable to try a new way. You're gonna to not escape or to not control basically means that you're gonna feel vulnerable with your sense of identity and your sense of safety feeling compromised in the present. And the reality is that it might not actually be compromised, which is where we have to look at our story and come to terms with, man, do I feel unsafe right now because this is an unsafe relationship? Or am I superimposing all of the harm I've been through onto this relationship and trying to read someone's mind about how they feel about me, which probably isn't even accurate? And and like our own defenses to stay safe start working against us in some ways, particularly if we experienced trauma of different kinds. So again, the whole idea here is compassion for where you find yourself and the capacity you have, and to start to just get curious about where you find yourself.
You mentioned your phone, and that got me thinking about how our culture, like even your phone, plays a role in your capacity, because a lot of people will escape into social media. But then it made me start to think about work and how some people do escape into work because they find their value in something, a project getting done, a task getting crossed off. But that can also be an external that we at Forte try to teach corporations, the HR representative, the boss, the leader, that your culture matters. And if you're creating a culture where everything that you say is about output, but then you introduce something and say, we care about you as a person, well, those are, very different things. You're saying your output is your value, but now all of a sudden you're saying, I think you are the valuable person. So it's really important too for leaders to understand the heart and mind and the mental fitness of their people and how you communicate, because that can be an external factor in mental capacity for your workers. If you're giving these disproportionate things to them of, I expect this output, and if you don't meet that, like you talked about earlier, there's danger I might lose my job. There's fear there. And so people are immediately going to go to, well, I have to pour everything into this job, and if I don't, I'm going to lose this job, because that's what's being communicated. But then out of the same voice is someone saying, but I care about you as an individual. So it was just making me think too, as leaders, as bosses, as coworkers, how important it is that we communicate what we actually mean. And if you do mean its output, expect for your people to face burnout quickly. That's something to consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a danger of our current cultural moment of well-being kind of being on the forefront of how businesses think about how they operate is that your employees will sense this this backwards motivation of valuing them, because ultimately you want to get more out of them. And that's not actually valuing someone for who they are. And again, so much we got to have grace for others too, because it makes sense why business leaders have pressure on them, and They're doing certain things in such a way. They're in their own battle of a window of tolerance, right? And it's not until we stop seeing each other as the problem and start having grace for each other and compassion that we can get somewhere. But back to the kind of original point of like, your employees will sense that. Of like, hey, this is you're doing this because you still just want more out of me, versus and you see me for who I am. And at the end of the day, it's appropriate. Businesses exist for business reasons, have outcome goals, right? It makes total sense. But there's this difference, and ultimately this erosion of your workforce when they can feel that ultimately we say this a lot here, you're treating your team as human doings, not human beings. And that they're disposable for the next person who's just willing to basically erode their sense of self and operate on hyper arousal because they're really good at it, but eventually it's not a long game, you know? And I would say to myself and my own small leadership capacities and to the businesses we work with is that we can't give away what we don't have. So much of this starts with valuing ourselves. And when we come to value ourselves for who we are, not what we do, we're able to look someone else in the face and see them in that same way and be like, and I think that that's kind of freeing rather than feeling like you have to muster up how you see people. It's like start with how you see yourself.
And there's going to be seasons where the output needs to be strained. It needs to be pushed in any kind of organization. And I think one of the number one things you can do as a leader is to go to that person and say, I see you putting in the extra work and I appreciate it. Because so often it's just expected and there's no humanity, there's no communication of like, you are doing a good job. And that matters to people. I'm a words of affirmation person and our boss Vineet does such a good job of that. I appreciate that he is aware of what's going on and will reach out and will call and ask those kind of questions because that matters to your employees, that you're seen as a human, especially in those seasons where they're like, hey, we need you to put in an extra effort here. That matters even more. So let's go ahead and move on. We've talked about that enough, but we talked about how your capacity can be shaped like by relationships, old wounds, still get triggered by present day stress and your phone and social media. So all of that being said, is there anything we can actually do about it? Let's get practical. You know what capacity is, where it comes from. The real question is, what do we do with that information now that we know what mental capacity is?
Yeah, definitely. So to the person, to the listener right now, as you're listening this, I would invite you to pause and ask yourself why it is you want to increase your mental capacity. Because as we approach this topic in our performance-driven mindset of our current moment, we are tempted to want to just increase our capacity so that we have more control. And again, that's not a actual increase of the capacity back to its original sense of like, when I have capacity, when I'm feeling calm, connected, creative, in touch with my sense of self, and when I'm operating in that way, it's not going to lead to burnout on the long run. And ultimately your work will be better anyway when you're in that place. Your right brain and your left brain are interconnected. You have your one aspect of the window of tolerance is that your prefrontal cortex is online. And essentially what that means is that all of your executive functioning is intact. You're planning, you're organizing. So when you're operating in that way, everything around you is going to go better. But the temptation is to try and jump to that. I want the results of operating in my capacity. And so we kind of get ourselves in this same exact trap of it's about performance. It's about the outcome. And there's this paradox of simply accepting where you find yourself and the limits of who you are and the story you had, and the capacity you hold in this present moment. Yeah. And as you begin to respect your own limits and the limits of others around you, naturally, over time, your capacity will expand, because our capacity shrinks when we stay in hyper arousal and we push. Our body's way of telling us that we need to slow down is going to continue to ramp up. So our window's actually going to be shrinking the more we operate outside of it and we try and do more. Your body essentially will be sending you this, all these different emotions to say, like, you need to rest, you need to recover, you need to slow down. And it'll get hypersensitive to the things that trigger you in the first place if you don't pay attention to the fact that they're there.
It's crazy to me as you were talking. I worked in ministry for a long time, and I would get sick after the Christmas season every year, like always. And I would constantly say to myself, that's my body telling me I'm exhausted. I can't do it anymore. I've pushed myself too far. And it was like, my wife and I just came to expect the 2 weeks after Christmas, I would be sick. And it always came to that point. And I think it's really interesting you brought that up, of how your body knows. It will give you clues. And then after years of that, I would head into the Christmas season already weary, because I would just be like, well, I'm going to be sick. My body's going to react this way. Yeah. So I just thought that was an interesting thing, that I saw that in my own life.
I think that is such a great analogy. And you started to expect it. And therefore, your capacity to operate that next Christmas season was actually diminished.
I wouldn't look forward to it. Yeah.
You wouldn't look forward to it. And to slow down a second and to come to terms with the limitations of where you find yourself, and to respect those limits and to simply operate within them, will, over time, again, kind of a paradox. There's a paradox. They will expand slowly. But at the same time, there's something important to call out here, and that there are plenty of us who we feel our window of tolerance, our capacity, really narrow in certain areas of life. And we've done some of our own internal processing and some of our own work in getting curious. And we recognize that it's attached to wounds. It's attached to potentially even like false narratives of how we feel about ourselves. And it's totally appropriate. And I'm going to bring in an example to this. And I talked about this on our last podcast, but like, for me, there's been like, I have wounds attached to work, right? I had two different scenarios where one, there was like a mass corporate layoff, and another scenario, basically two different times where I was like work unexpectedly ended. So now I find myself in my current job sometimes on edge. And if I were to simply kind of accept, I think there's something helpful about accepting that. Like, oh, okay, here's where I find myself. Like, this isn't about shame that I find myself there. But the next piece of it being like, if I'm on edge in my current work because I'm superimposing the wound from the past into my current environment, but the reality of my current work scenario is that I have no reason to actually be on edge, then my window of tolerance is not serving me well. There's this wound, there's this narrative of insecurity that has a hold on the present. And it actually is really helpful when you start to recognize something like that, to say, okay, I can expand this so that my ability to be to assess the accuracy of my work safety and security is on par with the reality of the current scenario. And it's not actually about what happened before. It's just about the reality of the current scenario with its good and bad. There's going to be both, right? It's like, and your ability to begin to assess reality for what it is, rather than superimpose it based on past wounds, is kind of the skill set that you develop to expand your window of tolerance. And one way to be thinking about that is, I call it making meaning. But essentially, if I, again, using my own example, if I were to look at the past story where I'll use the example of like I was at a big company, I got let go in this corporate layoff. Without kind of slowing down to make meaning of that experience, the meaning that I might actually interpret is I clearly didn't matter. I was disposable.
Yeah.
And then I find myself in my current workplace going, I doubt I matter. I'm disposable. But if I slow down enough to make meaning of that experience, I was one of so many people that got let go. And the reality is that it probably wasn't as personal as I'm making it out to be.
Right. Yeah.
And that the interworkings of a Fortune 1000 company making decisions based on like shareholder interest is not about my sense of self-worth.
Yep.
And as I make meaning of that experience in the context of people that I really trust, who can kind of reflect back to me what they're hearing me say, and I can feel the sense of anxiety that comes up when I'm processing that, and I can see your face, and I can see in your eyes that actually you think I do matter, regardless of what happened. I can now enter into my current work with a little bit less of a hold on me and a little bit more of an accurate ability to assess my current scenario for what it is.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. And you have such a great way of explaining things to where as you're talking, I'm like, man, I do this all the time. And the picture that was coming to my mind, and you're not going to understand this as a Californian, but in Michigan, we get a lot of snow and ice. And this idea of a window is making me think of my windshield in my car. If it's really cold out and I've got ice on the window, I can remote start the car and try and get the defrost going. And when I get out there, there's this little bit on the window that I can see through. And it's just reminding me these things that matter so much to us can start to kind of ice over our window of tolerance. And what we're talking about is the more you do this and the more you do this, the smaller your window gets. And it's just making me think of this ice here that it's causing me to have tunnel vision. It's causing me to bring in all of these outside sources of all of these things that I think are actually happening in this moment. But what we can train ourselves with mental fitness and mental capacity, learning about it, is to get that scraper out and start to scrape off the windshield and realize all of those external things that I thought were applying to this now is just my tunnel vision. And once I can recognize that, I can kind of get rid of all that. And now I have a clearer picture of what's out there. And it was just making me process like how important it is to not only understand mental capacity, but to do the things with it in our own lives. As you were talking about, I'm bringing in this baggage from something in the past that's not applicable to right now. And that's causing me to only see this part of the picture. And I need to expand that and train myself to be able to do that. So I loved what you said there. That was great.
Oh, thank you. And I love the analogies that you bring in. And I think a tricky part of this is that scraping the expansion process, particularly if there was difficult things that happened in your past, is lifelong.
Yep.
And I really wish it wasn't. I really wish I could sit here and go, I've assessed that within my current work, I don't need to have those same fears. Therefore, I'm good. But yet I find myself, again, autonomic nervous system. Every day we sense before we make sense. I'm picking up on all these cues and I'm interpreting them. And what came to mind is like, can you imagine the difference between like you scraping this ice off the window and being like, I can't believe I'm making this. It's taking me so long to get this ice off. And I can't believe all these mistakes that I made, that I found myself here. And a neighbor comes out who's lived in Michigan for decades and goes, this happened in my car for 20 years. I've got this certain type of scraper. Let me help you. And you're like, oh no, I can do it. And they're like, actually, wait, it's not because you can do it faster with this scraper. I actually just kind of want to help you because you're my neighbor.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're like, that. Oh, you want to help me because I'm your neighbor?
Yeah.
And it's not about the scraping efficiency. And like, it just does something to you when someone sees you for who you are and joins you in the process of that. And it goes back to our original needs of feeling seen and soothed and safe. And that's where bringing it around to kind of like plug some of what we do here at Forte is that, yes, we have tools and different things like that can help. But at the end of the day, there's an irreplaceable component of a relationship where you can actually feel some of the emotions that you start to feel at the edge of your window of tolerance, and you're feeling those emotions in the presence of a grounded nervous system, and it actually it will rewire yours in the way you see yourself. And that you cannot replace the relational process that is a lifelong relational process of coming to recognize your own worthiness and the fact that you matter and learning to trust in other people.
I think what you just painted is a great commercial for our coaches. And I know you were kind of beating around the bush there. I'll be direct. That's what our coaches are for. They're that neighbor who's going to come help you through this stuff. And what you do of helping our coaches is amazing, helping train them and everything. And it got me thinking too, of we live in a world right now where if I start to feel a certain way, and I told you I went through, 5-6 months of chronic pain, I was on my phone asking all the time, what does this mean? Why am I feeling this way? And now we're starting to see that with mental health. And AI is not going to be able to come alongside you and help you figure that out. It's going to look through a bunch of articles and give you data and information, but it's not going to know you. And that's why it's so important to have relationships, to have mental fitness coaches who can come alongside you and ask the right questions. And what you do in training those coaches is so vitally important. So I appreciate you, Richard, and Sandhya, and everybody involved, all of our coaches who help people along the way. We've covered a lot of ground today, from what capacity actually is to where it comes from to how you can work with yours more skillfully. But as always, we're not going to leave this in theory land. So I want to come back and do a rep for us right now. So today's rep, and this is super easy. Pick one thing you'll say no to. Not because you can't handle it, not because you're weak. That's the narrative that we're talking about. That's not true. It's because you're choosing to stay in your window instead of white knuckling through another commitment. So you might think, well, I'm letting someone down by saying no. But the constant pressure to say yes may make you end up running on fumes, reactive instead of ready. But when you respect your honest limit, you actually recover faster. And we talked about this. You show up sharper tomorrow. You actually build the capacity everyone's trying to force. So your rep is to ask, what's the one thing? Is it saying no to a meeting, no to a favor, no to a scroll session, the extra hour you were going to give away? Name it out loud and say no. That's your rep. And I actually made a video a while ago, and it reminds me of the clip from Elf. Have you seen that movie, Richard?
I have. One of my favorites.
When Elf is going to meet his dad for the first time, the secretary is out in the lobby, and she says something along the lines of, oh, I don't know, I've never declawed kittens before, and I'll just bring them over to the trailer later and I'll take care of it. And that's someone who has not built up the mental capacity to be able to say no. They just say yes to everything because they're afraid of letting someone down. And it's important because that person was overwhelmed to be able to say no. Otherwise, you're going to have to declaw kittens someday at your house. But I appreciate you, Richard, so much. And hopefully everything that you heard in today's podcast speaks to you as it has spoken to me and continues to speak to Richard. And we would love for you to check out Forte at getforte.com. You can follow us on our socials at getfortehq and learn more about mental fitness. Dive deeper. Take our mental fitness scan. Learn how you are doing in your mental capacity. So again, Richard, I appreciate you and everything that you've done. And before we go, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Again, appreciate getting to share in the reality of this process with you, hearing about some of the chronic health stuff you've gone through and talking honestly about our own struggles in this. And if anything, I just want to hear people who are listening that you're not alone in trying to figure out what this looks like to be human, to be who you are, to learn to trust others, to internalize your own sense of self-worth. And there's just so much grace for that process. So keep going is what I'd want to say to the person who's listening.